The engineering nightmare that almost broke Australia. Before the Sydney Harbour Bridge became a postcard, before it became a tourist photo, before people called it beautiful, it was a nightmare hanging over water. A giant steel question mark over Sydney Harbour. For years, people looked at that stretch of water and dreamed of a bridge. A bridge that would join the north and south. A bridge that would make Sydney feel whole. A bridge that would tell the world Australia was no longer a quiet outpost at the edge of an empire, but a modern nation ready to build something huge. But dreams are clean. Construction is not. When work began in 1923, Sydney did not just begin building a bridge. It began wrestling with fear, debt, death, politics, ambition, and a harbor that seemed almost too wide to conquer. Men would climb into the sky with steel under their boots and open air beneath them. Families would lose homes. Workers would risk their bodies for wages. Engineers would stare at numbers that had to be perfect, because if the numbers lied, the bridge would not simply fail. It could fall. And for years, the people of Sydney watched two giant halves of steel crawl toward each other across the harbor, not knowing if they would meet, not knowing if the dream would become a triumph, or one of the greatest disasters Australia had ever seen. This is not just the story of how the Sydney Harbour Bridge was built. This is the story of the engineering nightmare that almost broke Australia. To understand why the bridge mattered so much, you have to imagine Sydney before it existed. Today, the harbor looks beautiful. Calm water, ferries, opera house, city lights. But before the bridge, that same harbor was also a wall. It split the city in two. On one side was the city center, packed with business, government, shops, offices, and movement. On the other side was the North Shore, growing, waiting, separated by water. Every day, people crossed by ferry. Workers, families, traders, school children, everyone depended on boats. The harbor gave Sydney its beauty, but also slowed Sydney down. And that was the cruel thing. The very water that made the city famous was also holding it apart. For decades, people imagined ways to solve it. Some wanted a bridge. Some wanted a tunnel. Some sketched plans that looked bold on paper, but impossible in real life. The idea would appear, then disappear. It would be discussed, delayed, rejected, revived, and delayed again. Money was a problem. Politics was a problem. Engineering was a problem. And above all, fear was a problem. Because this was not a small creek crossing. This was Sydney Harbour. Deep, busy, wide, alive with ferries and ships. To build across, it meant lifting steel into the sky and trusting that human calculation could defeat gravity. That kind of project needs more than tools. It needs belief. And into that long dream stepped a man named John Bradfield. Bradfield was not just thinking about a bridge. He was thinking about a future city. He imagined trains moving across the harbor, roads connecting communities, a Sydney that could grow beyond its natural limits. To some people, it must have sounded too grand. But that is how great projects begin. First, they sound unreasonable. Then they sound expensive. Then they sound dangerous. And finally, when they are finished, everyone pretends they were obvious all along. But nothing about the Sydney Harbour Bridge was obvious. When the first major work began in 1923, the project did not rise beautifully from the water at once. It began with disruption. Land had to be cleared. Streets changed. Homes were demolished. Families who had lived in the path of progress were pushed aside. The bridge was not just going to cross the harbor. It was going to cut through neighborhoods. This is one of the hidden truths people often forget when they look at great landmarks. A landmark may become a symbol for everyone, but it is usually paid for first by ordinary people. People who never get statues. People whose houses stood in the wrong place. People whose names do not appear in the grand speeches. And while Sydney argued about the cost, the design, and the future, another force was waiting in the distance. The Great Depression. By the time the bridge was nearing completion, Australia would be under crushing economic pressure. Jobs were scarce. Families were struggling. Men were desperate for work. And this giant bridge, this expensive mountain of steel, rose above the harbor like both a promise and an accusation. To some it was hope. To others, it looked like madness. How could a country spend so much on steel while people were suffering? But to the men who worked on it, the answer was painfully simple. The bridge meant wages. The bridge meant food. The bridge meant survival. And so the nightmare continued. The contract to build the bridge went to Dorman Long, a British firm from Middlesbrough. The chosen design was a massive steel arch, not a delicate little crossing, not a simple road over water. This would be one of the largest and most daring arch bridges of its time. Steel came from far away. Granite came from Maruya. Workshops rose at Milsons Point. The harbor became a living machine. Imagine the sound. Hammering, drilling, rivets screaming under pressure. Steam, smoke, metal clashing against metal. Workers shouting through wind. Ferries passing below, full of people looking up at the unfinished monster growing above them. The bridge was not built quietly. It announced itself every day. And then came the part that looked almost impossible. The arch. The workers did not simply build a bridge across the water from one side to the other, like laying a plank across a stream. Instead, the two halves of the arch began to grow out from opposite shores. One from the south, one from the north. Slowly, steel arm reached towards steel arm. But until they met, they were not complete. They had to be held back by enormous cables, anchored into the rock, as if the land itself was gripping the bridge and stopping it from falling into the harbor. This is where the story becomes almost spiritual, because for months, Sydney watched a kind of steel ritual unfold over the water. Two unfinished halves suspended in the air, waiting for union. Below them was the harbor. Above them was the sky. Between them was a gap. And inside that gap lived every fear the engineers had tried to calculate away. What if the measurements were wrong? What if heat expanded the steel more than expected? What if one side moved differently from the other? What if the arch did not meet? What if this dream, this massive public promise, ended with a visible failure in front of the entire city? That was the nightmare. Not just the danger of death. Not just the danger of death. The danger of humiliation. The danger that Australia had reached too high, and the men working on the steel knew the danger better than anyone. They were called iron workers, riggers, boilermakers, riveters, laborers. But in truth, they were men walking above death. There were no modern safety systems like we expect today. A worker could be standing hundreds of feet above the harbor with wind pushing against his body and only his balance, his nerve, and his experience keeping him alive. The photographs from the construction look almost unreal now. Men sitting on steel beams as if they were sitting on a park bench. Men high above the water, eating, smoking, working, laughing. But those images can trick us, because courage in a photograph can look calm. In real life, courage has shaking hands. It has sore muscles. It has the sound of man falling. 16 workers died during construction. 16 lives swallowed by the making of an icon. And that number should slow us down. Because every time we say the bridge was a triumph, we should also remember that triumph had names. It had families. It had wives waiting at home. It had children who may have heard that their father would not be coming back. The bridge was beautiful, yes, but beauty can be built from grief. And all the while, the rivets kept coming. Millions of them, heated until they glowed red, passed into place, hammered, sealed, driven by hand into the body of the bridge. Every rivet was a small act of faith. One alone meant little. Millions together held the monster together. That is the strange truth about engineering. Greatness is not only found in the grand design. It is found in repeated human actions. One measurement, one bolt, one rivet, one shift, one risk, again and again and again, until the impossible begins to look permanent. But the most tense moment was still ahead. August 1930. The two halves of the arch were close now. For years, They had been reaching toward each other. The gap was shrinking. The city knew the moment was coming. Engineers watched carefully. Workers adjusted, measured, prepared. The bridge was no longer just a construction project. It was a public drama. A question hung over Sydney. Would the two halves meet? And on the 19th of August, 1930, they did. The two sides of the arch touched. Steel met steel above the harbor. The bridge became self-supporting. And in that moment, something changed. The city had watched a nightmare become real, and instead of collapsing, it held. Imagine standing there that day. The water below, the wind moving across the harbor, the great arch finally whole. For years, it had looked like two broken ribs reaching across the sky. Now it was one body. Sydney had stitched its wound with steel. But the job was not finished. The arch was only the skeleton. Now the bridge had to become useful. Roads had to be built. Railway tracks had to be laid. The deck had to be completed. Pipes, services, drainage, and cables had to be added. A bridge is not just a shape. It is a system. It has to carry weight. People, trains, cars, weather, heat, time. And before anyone could celebrate, the builders had to answer one final question. Could it hold? In early 1932, they tested it in a way that still feels dramatic today. Steam locomotives were brought onto the bridge. Heavy engines lined across the rail tracks, putting huge weight on the structure. Think about that sight. The bridge, fresh and new, loaded with iron beasts. The harbor underneath. The city watching. It was like asking the bridge to prove its soul. And it passed. The steel held. The nightmare had survived the test. By March 1932, Sydney was ready for the opening. But the timing was bitter. Australia was deep in the Depression. People were hurting. The bridge had cost millions. Its nickname, the Iron Lung, carried a strange meaning. Like an iron lung keeping a body alive, the bridge had kept many men employed during dark times. It had given work when work was disappearing. But it had also become a symbol of tension. Who owned this triumph? The government? The engineers? The workers? The people? On the 19th of March, 1932, huge crowds gathered. The city prepared to celebrate. Premier Jack Lang was meant to cut the ribbon and officially open the bridge. Then, suddenly, the ceremony was interrupted. A man named Francis de Groot rode forward on horseback. Before Lang could cut the ribbon, de Groot slashed it with his sword. For a moment, the carefully planned ceremony broke open into chaos. The ribbon had to be tied again. De Groot was arrested. The official opening continued. But the moment became part of the legend because it revealed something deeper. Even at its birth, the bridge was not only steel and stone. It was power. It was politics. It was pride. It was a question of who had the right to claim the future. And maybe that is why the Sydney Harbour Bridge still feels so powerful today. It was never just a way to cross water. It was a battle over identity. When people finally crossed it, they were not only crossing from north to south. They were crossing from one version of Australia into another. A country that had doubted itself had built something enormous. A city split by water had joined itself together. A population wounded by economic fear had been given a symbol that said, "We are still here." But here is the revelation. The bridge did not remove the cost. It only covered it in glory. Under the fame, there were demolished homes. Under the beauty, there was debt. Under the national pride, there were injured bodies, damaged hearing, exhausted workers, and 16 men who never saw the completed bridge as the public saw it. That is the forbidden truth of great monuments. They ask ordinary people to pay extraordinary prices. Then later generations call the result destiny. But it was not destiny. It was decision. It was risk. It was sweat. It was danger. It was calculation so exact that a small mistake could have turned celebration into mourning. And that is why the Sydney Harbour Bridge deserves more than casual admiration. Do not look at it only as a nice structure. Look at it as a warning that progress is never clean. A warning that ambition always has a shadow. A warning that every nation has moments when it must decide whether to stay safe on the shore or build into the unknown. Between 1923 and 1932, Australia chose the unknown. And for almost 9 years, the harbor became a test of engineering, a test of money, a test of patience, a test of nerve, a test of whether human beings could force steel, stone, and gravity to obey a vision. Today, the Sydney Harbour Bridge stands so calmly that it almost hides what it took to create it. Cars pass over it, trains move across it, tourists climb it, cameras capture it, fireworks explode around it on New Year's Eve. People look at it and see confidence. But if you listen closely, the bridge tells an older story. You can almost hear the rivets. You can almost feel the wind around the workers. You can almost see the two halves of the arch reaching across the harbor, separated by that terrifying final gap. And you can imagine the silence before they joined. That silence was the sound of a city holding its breath. Because if the bridge failed, it would not have been just an engineering failure. It would have been a national wound. But it did not fail. It held. And when it held, it changed Sydney forever. The North Shore became more connected. The city expanded. Daily life changed. The bridge became part of Australia's image to the world. What began as a risky dream became one of the most famous landmarks on Earth. But perhaps the real miracle is not that the bridge still stands. The real miracle is that people dared to build it at all. They built it without the tools we have today. They built it through danger. They built it through economic fear. They built it while the world around them was becoming uncertain. They built it when many people had reason to doubt. And maybe that is why the bridge still matters. Because every generation has its own harbor. Something wide, something frightening, something that separates where people are from where they need to go. And every generation has to decide whether to wait for easier times or start building anyway. The Sydney Harbour Bridge was not born from comfort. It was born from pressure. It was born from a city divided by water, a country hungry for confidence, and workers who climbed into the sky with death beneath their boots. So the next time you see the bridge, do not just see steel. See the men in the wind. See the families forced aside. See the engineers watching the measurements. See the glowing rivets. See the crowds waiting. See the sword cutting the ribbon. See the two halves of the arch reaching toward each other over the deep water, as if the whole country was waiting for them to touch. Because before it became an icon, it was a nightmare. Before it became beautiful, it was terrifying. Before it became Australia's pride, it almost broke Australia's nerve. And now I want to ask you, do you think the Sydney Harbour Bridge is Australia's greatest engineering achievement? Or is there another landmark that deserves that title? Share your answer in the comments. And if this story made you see the bridge differently, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because there are many more hidden stories behind the monuments we think we already know.